Hello, I'm the Hatter Professor. Let's talk hats. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Hats with the Hatter Professor. That's me, Brad Bowers. Today I want to talk about John B. Stetson, the man. There's part of his biography that has become larger than life. It's a mythologized part of Stetson hat's history, and it's really wrapped up in the whole story of how John B. Stetson gets his start in hat making. I want to look deeper into it because parts of that story just don't ring true. There's too much about it that's questionable. So I thought, let's take a deeper dive. Let's look at the veracity of the story, see if we can figure out where it came from, how much of it might be fact, and how much of it might be fiction. We'll start in the late 1850s. Stetson, as a young man, had worked for his father, Stephen Stetson, who had his own hatting company. Stephen Stetson passes away, and around the same time, in the late 1850s, Stetson is diagnosed with consumption. So, like many people in the 19th century, he heads west to try and improve his health and hopefully have a better lease on life, or at least a chance of living a little bit longer. And while he is out west, he heads to the Pike's Peak Gold Rush in Colorado. And the story goes that he fashions a hat out of beaver fur. Apparently, you'll hear various versions of this, or you'll read various versions of this, where he needed a hat, and so he would take the beaver pelt and strip the fur off and make a bow to start the felting process and make a felt hat, which he then sells to a cowboy or a bullwhacker for $5, and then ends up getting better, doesn't strike it rich in the gold rush, goes back to Philadelphia in 1865, opens up his own hat company. That's the basics of the story. As I said, you'll run across different variations of it online if you start looking into it. But as I said, some of the things don't ring true. Mostly, it's the part about making a hat from scratch, taking the beaver pelts, stripping the fur down, felting a hat body. But then there's also the fact that if you look at some versions of the story and he needs a hat and he makes himself one to, stay dry in the weather, that makes no sense at all because hats were so much a part of everyday wear for men that are going to be in the outdoors. And if Stetson was heading west, he definitely would have had a hat with him. There's also the idea that the cowboy or the bullwhacker, whoever it may be, finds the hat so attractive that he's never seen anything like it, and he wants to buy it from Stetson, which he does, and that gives Stetson the idea that, hey, I can sell hats out here. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense either because everybody else would have had a hat, and just the fact that Stetson's trying to make a hat from scratch with no real hatting tools doesn't make much sense. So I started looking into this and trying to figure out, okay, where does this story come from? And if you look through his biographies, and we'll go through them in chronological order, they tell various versions of that story, or they don't tell the story at all. For instance, in the book published in 1895 called Contemporary American Biography, there's a lengthy biography of John B. Stetson, but it jumps from where he's working for his father to opening his own business. And there's nothing about his trip to the West there. A few years later, Who's Who in America published an edition, 1899-1900 edition. And in that biography, which is a very brief one, but there is no mention of his trip to the West as well. Shortly after Stetson's death in February of 1906, the Silk Association of America, in their 1906 annual report, publishes an in memoriam section which has a biography in it. Stetson manufactured silk ribbons for his hats, and so he was a member of the Silk Association of America. And in that obituary, there is no mention of his trip to the West either. So here we have several decades worth of biographies that don't mention that fact. In 1911, there's a book called The Americana. It's kind of like an encyclopedia, which gives a biography of Stetson. This one's actually written by William F. Frey, who was the first vice president of John B. Stetson Company at the time in 1911. And in it, he talks about Stetson opening a small factory in 1865 with just a couple of employees in one room, and then eventually building it up into the hat manufacturing industry. No mention of his trip to the West at all. So the first mention we get of any of this trip to the West comes from a book by Elbert Hubbard. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But from that point on, you begin to see every once in a while that story creep into Stetson bios. So, for instance, in December of 1912, there's a newspaper article published in which H.N. Wright, the advertising director of Stetson, mentions parts of this story about going west and going to Colorado. However, there's no mention of fashioning a hat out on the trail. 2 years later, in 1914, Moody's Magazine, they have a brief biography of Stetson as well. It talks about Stetson heading west to recover his health, heals up, comes back to Philadelphia in 1865, and opens his own hat factory. No mention of the Pike's Peak Gold Rush, for instance, just heading west, and certainly no mention of making a hat out on the trail. In 1915, in the Encyclopedia of Pennsylvania biography, there is also the story of Stetson going west and going to Missouri and then Colorado, but no mention of the hat-making story. The hat-making story originates with a man named Elbert Hubbard. Elbert Hubbard, and I encourage you to look him up because I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about him. He was an author, a philosopher, a utopian in a way, because he's a member of Roycroft, which is a utopian community in New York that is working on arts and crafts things. They're actually, one of the bigger parts of the arts and crafts movement at the time. But Hubbard starts Roycroft Press. That's the name we give it now, but it's a publishing company that publishes books that he writes and that others write. He's a self-described anarchist and socialist, and that's neither here nor there, other than to say he is outside of mainstream thinking. And the guy's not a historian. He's a very good writer, though, and he's most famous for a series of biographical sketches on the little houses of famous people. And this is where the Stetson story comes in to play. Hubbard writes his biography of Stetson, and the little house he's talking about is actually the factory. It's not talking about the home that Stetson lives in, but it's a 47-page booklet that is going to talk about the history of Stetson and his company, how it operates. In this little publication, Hubbard mentions that, he had consumption. And so he moves to Illinois. but it's not improved in Illinois. The humidity is pretty bad there. He ends up then going on to Missouri to St. Joseph, or St. Joe as they call it there. And in St. Joe, he begins working at a brickyard on the banks of the Missouri River. And over the course of a couple years, he goes from working at the brickyard to managing the brickyard to being a co-owner of the brickyard. And then a flood comes along and wipes out all of his hard work. The brickyard's gone. So he tries to enlist in the Union Army with the Civil War going on. But because of his health, he is, denied. At that point, he joins with a group of prospectors heading to the Pike's Peak Gold Rush in Colorado, because St. Joe is a good stopping off point for heading west. And here's where Hubbard gets quite fanciful. One night, there's rain, a lot of rain, a deluge, and Stetson and all these men are trying to keep dry. They're taking pelts that they've acquired on their trip, beaver, rabbit, deer, whatever they've got. He lists a bunch of them, and they're trying to sew them together to make a tent. I guess nobody thought to bring a tent on this journey. Well, Stetson tells the story that you can take the fur and make a fabric out of it called felt. And the guys are like, "No way, you're pulling our leg here." And he says, "No, I was in the felting business before. I was making hats, with my dad, and this is something that's been known for thousands of years, how to make felt." And he decides to prove it to them. So he takes beaver pelt, takes his knife, shaves the fur off. It details how he makes a bow, which was an old-time tool used to felt the fur together. You would snap it against the fur, and it helps to bring it together with, some hot water in there. And he ends up, fashioning this piece of felt. They're so impressed by this, they end up felting a tent. And I can't imagine how many pelts it would have taken to felt a tent, or how long it would have taken. But I'm sure the rain was done by the time they got done with this. Well, he takes part of that felt and he makes a hat out of it. And he's wearing the hat. And one day they come across a bullwhacker riding on an expensive Spanish silver encrusted saddle. And the bullwhacker is so impressed with the hat that he pays him with the $5 coin. And, Stetson's happy to sell it to him. The men make it out to Pike's Peak Gold Rush, don't find anything. Stetson then comes back to Philadelphia, opens his factory. Well, a lot of issues with this particular story. First, as I said, trying to make a tent out of felt. That would have just taken forever. It would have taken so many pelts. I'm not even sure why they were, gathering pelts as they went, other than maybe, they're going to sell them later on if they need to make some money. The idea of Stetson making a hat out of some of that felt, it would have taken probably several beaver pelts. And I also wonder how many beaver were around on the plains of Kansas at that time. Beaver had been almost trapped to extinction by the 1830s. So maybe by the 1860s, their numbers are rebounding, and maybe they did find some in, the streams of Kansas. But just the idea that, he's going to have enough beaver pelts there and can shave them all down. And then to make the tools that he needs, you could probably make a piece of felt, perhaps. But how does he block it? It doesn't talk about that. How does he shape it? Does he put a ribbon on it? Doesn't talk about that either. So what we're left with are a lot of questions about this whole story. Did any of this happen? Well, I tell you what, when you're reading Hubbard's story, there is a passage in there, and he says, and I'm quoting, "Now here is a story that was told me for fact. But when I once asked Stetson about it, he only laughed and said I should not believe half I heard. However, I still believe the tale is sure enough true, and so I give it nothing extenuating and setting down naught in malice." Stetson himself laughs at this story and says, "Don't believe half of what you hear." And yet Hubbard says, I like the story. I'm going to go with it. I'm going to believe it. Stetson himself then appears to shoot down at least part of this story. And I'm going to speculate it's probably the more implausible parts of the story. Did Stetson have consumption? Well, he probably was ill and was misdiagnosed. Because he ends up living, a long, healthy life, dying in, 1906 after being born in 1830. So it's a pretty good life for the 19th century. So if he's ill and he's diagnosed with consumption, then it makes sense he would head west. Where we run into issues with the story is trying to figure out where in the West did he go? Is the story about St. Joe true? Is the story about Colorado true? Here are the facts as I found them. Stetson is missing from the 1860 census. Now, that's not unusual if people are traveling, and you can imagine that if somebody is somewhere out west and not around when a census taker comes by, that he would be left out. So right there, the fact that he's not in the 1860 census tells us, okay, he's not settled down in Philadelphia. He apparently is not settled in St. Joe at that point. So where was he? Well, I'm guessing somewhere in between. I think the absence in the census tells us that he probably was traveling. And so this lends some credence to the diagnosis of consumption. I had researchers in St. Joe look into this for me, looking for the brickyard, for instance. There are several brickyards listed in the city directories in the late 1850s, early 1860s. Only one of them seems to be close to the Missouri River, and the name associated with it is not Stetson. And if Stetson was a co-owner, I have not run across the name of whoever was the original owner. There's also, in the newspapers, no records of floods in that time that would have done enough damage to wipe out a brickyard. Because if it wiped out a brickyard, it would have done a lot of other damage to St. Joe. And there just isn't. There are, major floods that are documented. The worst one before this was 1844. And there'll be one long after that. But there's nothing in the late 1850s, early 1860s. So I question at least part of the brickyard story. I'm thinking that maybe he did work at the brickyard for a while, but whether he was a co-owner, I don't know. But it certainly doesn't appear to have been wiped out by a flood. For the Colorado portion of the story, no evidence beyond what shows up after Hubbard's publication. And from then on, as I mentioned before, his biographies after the publication of Hubbard's book do talk about traveling west to Colorado. And Stetson probably did that. However, I'm guessing what Stetson laughed about and said, "Don't believe half of what you heard," is the entire story about making a hat out of felt or making a tent out of felt or any of that part of the story. So then the question becomes, did Hubbard make this up, or did he hear it from somebody else and, mention it to Stetson and Stetson laughed it off? Not sure. But the fact that I can't find any evidence of it prior to Hubbard kind of leads me to suspect Hubbard made it up himself. I mean, it's not above the kinds of things he would do. He was well known for sensationalizing stories in his writing. So if that's his stock in trade, then he probably put that in there just to make it seem much more interesting and exciting. I kind of liken this to what Washington Irving did in his biography of Christopher Columbus. Washington Irving, writing his biography of Columbus in the early 19th century, is thinking that, I'm telling Columbus's story, but it's not exciting enough. I really want to make Columbus a hero to American school kids when they read about him. And so I need to embellish some of his story. And so from Washington Irving, we get the myth that everyone in the world in 1492 thought the earth was flat, but not Columbus. He knew it was round, and he was going to prove it by sailing west to the Indies. Well, we know historically for a fact that nobody in 1492 thought the earth was flat, outside of perhaps a handful of ecclesiastical people in Spain. It's questionable. But the whole idea that people thought the earth was flat, no. Everybody knew it was round. Columbus gets into trouble because he undercalculates the circumference of the earth and some other things, and that's why people don't necessarily trust him with their money to send him west, until Ferdinand and Isabella do. But it's from Washington Irving in the 1820s that we get that myth that still is taught to American school kids. I ask my students in class, hey, did you guys hear this when you were in grade school? And, some of them still have heard it. So he's trying to make Columbus seem more daring and epic than he actually was. And I think that's what's going on with Hubbard and with Stetson. Trying to make Stetson seem like, all of these men were just clueless about felt. They hadn't heard of felt, really? They're wearing hats out of felt. I have no doubt about that. If you're going west, you're going to have a hat with you, especially a broad-brimmed one, because you're going to be out there in the elements. And then, fashioning a hat and selling it. So I don't believe that part of the story. I hate to break it to my good friends at Stetson, but I don't think that part of the story is true. I feel comfortable saying, yeah, he probably did go to Colorado during the gold rush for his health and maybe hoping to strike it rich. But what I think happened on that trip is he recognized a market. He saw an untapped market, recognized the potential. All these people going to Colorado, staying in Colorado, or even around the West. And he's thinking, the hatters back east are focusing on selling hats to people back east. I'm thinking he thought, you know what? I could sell hats to people out west, and I could make a lot of money that way. Stetson, excellent marketer. He really is. I mean, how else could he have grown the John B. Stetson Company into the largest hat manufacturing in the United States and, maybe one of the largest in the world? So I think he recognized the potential of selling hats to Westerners. And when he starts making hats in Philadelphia, he does advertise to people in the West and the Southwest. He sends them, information and samples of his hats. So that's why I think, Yeah, the Colorado part of the story is probably true, but the other part isn't. Let me know what you think. They say absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, or is it the other way around? Whatever. Let me know if you agree, if you think that Stetson probably went to the West. Was he diagnosed with consumption either correctly or incorrectly? And what role do you think this plays in the mythology of Stetson and Stetson hats? I just would kind of like to hear your thoughts on that. In case you're wondering, today's hat is a Stetson Derby from the 1910s. Beautiful condition and in my exact size. So I'm proud to wear this over 100 years after it was made. Anyway, thanks for spending time with me. I'll see you next time.